very full morning.
Yeah, can you see it?
There we go. Absolutely. Good morning, everyone. It seems like we've been going nonstop for quite a while. If you've looked at the calendar, we've actually given ourselves a break. Mercedes, if I'm reading our calendar right, we don't have a meeting scheduled for next week, Tuesday.
I do not believe so, but I will double check and confirm that by the end of the meeting.
That's not to say we couldn't fill a calendar with very useful and important work, but I think that we've been working so productively offline that one of the things we hope this morning, we've got 2 presentations, but we also have built in an opportunity to catch up on where we are with some of the proposals that are pending. So I think that today's meeting really will be very productive and will give us a sense of where we stand in terms of our goals to meet the objectives of the task force. Let's begin this morning with a review of the minutes from last week. I assume and hope everyone's had an opportunity to review the minutes. Are there any modifications, additions, or suggestions to the minutes? Okay, hearing none, is there a motion?
Anderson, this is Mike. I move we approve the minutes.
Thank you. Second?
I second.
All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Okay, the motion carries. Excellent. Mercedes, we've got a special guest this morning, Dr. Crozier. He is joining us. He and the organization he may tell us just take a moment to tell us about is a new asset for the entire state of North Carolina and the country, the Duke Center for Science and Law. And one of the things we've asked Dr. Crozier to speak to us about are the disparate impacts of some court actions and penalties of a financial nature that have a racially disparate impact, especially on the sort of the intake of the criminal justice system. So we're happy to have you, Dr. Crozier, and look forward to your presentation. Thank you, sir.
Great. Yeah, I'm happy to be here. Let me try to get my screen sharing and then see if I can quite manage this without too many misclicks. All right. Can we see my slides?
Yes.
Great. Okay. So a real quick introduction. It's really great to be here and talk to you guys about some of the research that we're doing at Duke. I'm the research director at the Center for Science and Justice, which is headed by Brandon Garrett, who's at the Duke Law School. Kind of broadly, we're really interested in looking at anything to do with the criminal justice system and increasing its fairness and its efficiency. We have some more specific areas, but we have really broad interests. But one of those interests is doing work here in North Carolina. We want to be an asset to the communities that we live and work in. So some of our initial research when we started in 2018 looked at data and the courts in North Carolina, which is one of the projects that I'm going to talk about. And those projects kind of have spiraled off and taken on their own follow-up studies and follow-up focuses. But again, even though we're doing a lot of national research, we're still really interested in doing stuff here in North Carolina. So one of these topics is, of course, driver's license suspensions in North Carolina due to failures to appear and failures to comply or failures to pay. So real quick before I kind of get into the research that we've been doing, I want to point out that when I say FTC, what I mean is failure to comply or failure to pay. I think that there is a little bit of wiggle room there between technically you might be able to have a failure to comply without failure to pay, but the vast majority of these are people who are not paying fines and fees in the justice system. Oh, my slides are popping up a little bit out of order here, sorry. So I'm going to talk kind of about 3 studies that we're doing today. The first of which is published in the Duke Law Journal last year. And I'm going to look at the driver's license suspensions in North Carolina using court data that we got from the Administrative Office of the Courts. And then I'm also going to talk about some follow-up studies. So we have tried to survey people to better understand the impact of these driver's license suspensions. And through that, we kind of noticed that it's difficult to get in touch with some of these people, but then eventually we did, and we were able to survey them about their experiences. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then finally, I just want to talk really briefly about some of the data we have on failures to comply in general. So not just related to driver's license, but to show how widespread some of these FTCs are. So again, whenever I say FTCs, what I mean is a failure to pay. This is usually a cost associated with some charge or speeding ticket. There's also these fees that get tacked on in the court system. I have some examples later on in the slides. And then when I say an FTA, I mean a failure to appear. So somebody who has a scheduled court date, doesn't appear, and then after about, I think it's 20 days, they get contacted that they have an official notice to appear, and that starts a whole different kind of legal machinery. And I'll also add that if you guys have any questions at any point, I can't see the chat because I have the screen share up, but feel free to interrupt me, or Mercedes, if somebody asks me a question in the chat and you want to read it off, I can deal with the interruption. So, all right. So first, looking at these driver's license suspensions in North Carolina. So in North Carolina, if you have an FTA or an FTC that's outstanding for a traffic charge, you can get your driver's license suspended indefinitely. That is until you solve that FTA or that FTC. The FTA or the FTC is imposed. So if you miss your court date or if you miss a payment, and then after either 40 days for the FTA or 20 days for the FTC, the notice gets sent to the DMV, who then issues the suspension. We received AOC data from September 2018 on all the active driver's license suspensions for these FTAs and FTCs. So if you're interested in the data, I can talk a little bit more about that. I will caveat that these data aren't perfect. I mean, this is the issue with millions of rows of data, is that it's really big, and sometimes we have to make choices about how we clean it up. But for the most part, these data exclude other driver's license suspension causes. So if there's somebody out there who has a suspension for DUI, or maybe some safety concern, like too many points on their license, those people aren't in these data sets. Instead, this is just the people who are suspended for an FTA, an FTC, or in some cases both. And the big picture that we find here is that there's over 1.22 million suspensions. I say this conservatively because of how we cleaned the data. So I think that there very well could be more of these suspensions, but this is a lot. The vast majority of these suspensions were due for somebody who had one or more failure to appear. So almost 830,000 of them, of these 1.22 million, were for people who weren't appearing in court. A still very significant number, but not quite as many, 263,000 about, were for failures to pay. And then finally, there's a subset of people, about 135,000 people, who have an FTA and an FTC. So I split these people out because these are going to be maybe an FTA for one case and an FTC for another case. But I split these people out because I think it's important to point out, and I'll kind of come back to this at the end, that if there was some, say, retroactive legislation passed that said, we're going to get rid of all the FTC suspensions, that would still leave quite a few people with a driver's license suspension for an FTA. And so for some of these cases, they're probably pretty complicated and have been going on for a really long time. So there's no simple solution here to maybe restoring a driver's license. So a couple quick figures kind of showing some of our data. We see that suspensions are increasing over time. So our data go all the way back to the 1980s. As you can see, there's not a ton of these suspensions in the 1980s, but as we get closer to the present day, the number of suspensions for failures to appear, for failures to pay, and for both failures to appear and failures to pay go up. Obviously, the failures to appear are kind of the most. I'll point out here that these data are only active suspensions. So like, let's say you had a suspension and you paid it off in 2017, then you would not appear in our data set here. So I think that might kind of explain why you see this little bit of a dip in 2015. 2014. I think that represents people who are probably managing to, after maybe a year or two of having their driver's license suspended, manage to, get their ducks in order and, solve their suspension and get it cured. And then you see this really steep increase, especially for FTAs recently, because these people haven't quite had a chance to work through the system yet. But especially compared to, even 20 years ago in 2000, we see quite an increase in the number of these driver's license suspensions.
So William, this is Mike. Can I jump in? So,
Of course.
So you're saying these are active cases. So that 1.22 million figure that you gave in the last slide, does that mean that there are 1 million people driving around in North Carolina without driver's licenses right now?
Kind of. I will add that so I always offer this caveat because there are people in North Carolina that have in our data set that have addresses from other states. So these might be people that are, down from a fishing trip from Virginia, and then, they get pulled over and they get their license suspended in North Carolina. But that also doesn't include the people that live in North Carolina that might be fishing in Virginia and get their license suspended there. So our data don't directly say that it's 1.2 million drivers driving around without a suspended license, but I would venture to say that it's probably pretty close around there.
This is Josh Stein. I don't understand this chart. How it says the total FTA is 60 to 70,000, but you were saying it was 830,000. Is this somehow cumulative? But then you also said it was paid off somehow.
Yeah, so this is by year. So in 2018, there were a little over 60,000 failures to appear with a 2016 date. In 2017, it would have been right around 60,000. So you add those two together, and if you basically add up all these data points on this line, then you get that 827,000 number.
Okay.
So we also see that there's some pretty significant variation across the state on how driver's licenses are getting suspended, but it is happening basically in every county. So what I'm showing you here is a graph that basically shows you have along the x-axis along the bottom, you have the size of the county population that's 16 years or older. So basically your drivers or potential drivers. And then along the y-axis, you have the number of suspensions for FTAs or FTCs. And what we see here is actually a pretty clear linear relationship that the more people you have in a county, the more driver's license suspensions you have, which really makes a lot of sense whenever you think about it. Obviously, because of how North Carolina counties are structured, you have a lot of counties in that bottom left of the corner that don't have a huge population. So they also don't have a ton of suspensions. But I think it is also kind of worth pointing out that some of these counties are a little bit of outliers. So if you look at Mecklenburg, right, compared to Wake County, they have very similar county population sizes, but Wake has far more suspensions than Mecklenburg does. So I think it's worth, pointing out that Mecklenburg's obviously probably doing something that these other states aren't, or these other counties aren't. And then there is a little variation to show that how different counties deal with these suspensions varies a little bit. And then I think maybe what you guys are most interested in is we're also interested in looking at racial disparity in suspensions. So this is a pie chart showing the suspensions in North Carolina by race. One thing that's worth pointing out here is that white people make up about 31% of the suspensions, whereas Black people make up about 41% of the suspensions. But whenever we compare that to the North Carolina population, right, this is where we see this racial disparity. So despite only making up 21% about of the North Carolina population, they're overrepresented by a factor of about 2, right? Black people represent twice the number of suspensions that we would expect based on their percentage of the population. We also see that Latinx individuals are also overrepresented, and the Asian and the Native American categories are so small that it's really hard to make a conclusion. But the main takeaway here, I think, is that whites are pretty vastly underrepresented in these suspensions, and we see that because, particularly because Black people and Latinx people are being overrepresented.
Only about 5 minutes left.
Okay. So we're also interested in the economic disparity and this interaction with race. I'm going to go through this kind of quickly, and it is kind of complicated, so I can come back if you're interested. But what we did is we imagine you have an average county in North Carolina, and you added in 10 white people that were below the poverty line, if you did that based on our data, we would expect to see an increase in FTA suspensions by a little over 3. So that's what this kind of first bar, I don't know if you guys can see my mouse or not, but that's what this first kind of clump of people represents. And then we see a slightly smaller increase in FTCs or both suspensions. If we add in 10 white people above the poverty line, then we see a smaller increase in those factors, right? So we only see an increase of FTA suspensions by 2, and then less than 1 FTC suspension and less than 1 both suspension. So what this means essentially is that there's evidence here that white people below the poverty line are at greater risk or are impacted more harshly by these suspensions. However, we see the opposite trend when we look at Black people below poverty. So we see very few suspension increase when you add 10 people below Black poverty line, but whenever we add 10 Black people above the poverty line, we see a much greater increase. So we take this as evidence kind of big picture that both race and income or economic position are playing a factor in kind of the risk of getting suspended and how easy it is to fix these suspensions. But it's also kind of a complicated relationship where it's not just because you're poor that automatically means that you're at risk for suspension. So with the last couple minutes, I just want to go through some quick data about the impact of these suspensions. So we were interested in, so this previous data were at the county level, not at the individual level, right? So we can describe relationships between a county population, but we can't say a person who makes less than $20,000 is at a greater risk for suspension. And we want to be able to do that. So our first attempt, we wanted to send out a mail survey. So we had physical addresses from this AOC data set. So we sent them surveys. We found about 300 Wake County residents who had a recent suspension. Unfortunately, over a third of these got returned as undeliverable. So they never even made it to their intended recipient. So this raises the question of, do these people know that they're suspended if it's this difficult to get them mail, which is what the DMV uses and the addresses that the DMV uses to contact them. So our next approach was to use an online survey. So we recruited 853 participants online. Of these 853 random people that we found online, about 18% or 151 of them either had a suspension or had a suspension in North Carolina. So you can see the breakdown here. I'm going to go through this kind of quickly, but I'll point out that a little over 40% of these people had their suspension for a failure to appear or failure to pay. So not everyone. This data set does have, say, DUIs in it, but we're just going to kind of generalize here about what the impact of driver's license suspension is, even though there are quite a few people here that do have FTAs and FTCs. So again, kind of the most interesting thing we find here is that white respondents were significantly less likely to be suspended than Black and all non-white respondents. We also find that respondents who make more than $50,000 a year were significantly less likely to be suspended than those making less. So if you make less than $50,000 a year, that puts you at a greater risk of being suspended, according to this survey. And then finally, just to point out kind of how complicated these data are, respondents that make less than $13,000 a year, so like really at the bottom end of kind of the economic income rate, were less likely to be suspended. So it does seem like maybe the people who are the poorest, their navigation through this system is a little bit different than those who make more than that. We also found that poor white people are the most likely to be suspended than any other race or income category, but that may just be because of the demographics of the people responding to the survey. I'll go over this really quickly, but basically what we find is that having a driver's license suspension really negatively impacts your day-to-day life. So on things like getting to work, keeping a job, grocery shopping, having fun, getting an education, all of these are rated as much more difficult when you have a driver's license suspension. And then finally, I think the last point that I'll make, because I think I'm coming up on the end of time here, we asked people about their behavior if they had a suspension, and we found that about 30% of them report still driving, even though they have a suspension. 50% of them had said that they'd tried to get their license restored. I think that, and then 33% said that they were afraid to go to court. So I think these numbers are particularly interesting in the context that non-suspended respondents, we compared their answers, and they predicted their behavior would be much different. So only 14% said that they would still still drive, even though 30% of people still do drive. And 90% said that they would attempt to get their driver's license restored, even though only about 50% actually do. So the impact of this driver's license suspension might be kind of unknowable unless you actually have it. And then I just want to point out, I think, how am I out of time here? I think I am.
Well, yeah, take the next 2 minutes or so to complete your thought.
All right. I just want to point out that FTCs are obviously a pretty big issue in North Carolina. So if you're interested in failure to appear data, or if you're interested to kind of seeing what failures to appear look like in North Carolina, we have a big data set that we've posted on this website here that's in the slides that I shared. And you can also find by just Googling the Science for Justice website, but it's an interactive website where you can kind of sort about FTC data. So if you're interested in how long FTCs go on, what the demographic differences are for people who have an FTC, what FTCs look at over time, you can go to this website and kind of navigate it. And we're always welcome to hear people's thoughts on it, so you can contact us with it as well. So I have a bit more, but I can go ahead and stop there and answer your guys' questions.
Well, thank you. Let's just take a survey if there are any immediate questions for Dr. Crozier on this presentation, this morning's presentation.
I have a comment. In district court, of course, I see this a lot, and the penalties are significant for missing court on a traffic violation. For example, a high school or college student charged, well, even if it's an infraction of seatbelt violation, for which the cost would be about $179, unless they need time to pay, then the additional $20 is added on. But if a high school student misses court for seatbelt violation, the FTA fee is $200, more than the actual cost of the original ticket. And the restoration fee is another $100. So you're looking at an additional $300 on a seatbelt violation that would really have had essentially no consequences other than the cost. And they just really add up to an enormous amount of money that you can't pay. Folks are having difficulty paying, and that leads to all these fees and fines that keep totaling if they're again stopped for failing to have a valid license. So I just want to say that's just my observation. I mean, these, like you say, fees can stack up, and they absolutely do, and it results in people not having a license and being unable to get one. In order to get that stricken, usually involves hiring an attorney, which is an additional cost. So it just seems like there's a better way for these folks to have access to have these issues addressed in court.
Yeah, I'll add that these driver's license suspensions are indefinite until they're solved. So in some ways, they can be even more punitive than something like a DUI, which has an expiration date on the suspension, and you get your driver's license back. So.
I've got a question. You have these conversations with folks. Sometimes they say, well, it makes them pay. It holds something over their head, and they're going to lose their license. It makes them pay their fine. I don't know if that's true or not. Is there collection data from other jurisdictions where they have made some effort to reform the system?
I'm not sure about other jurisdictions. I can say that whenever we look, so what I have up now is all the FTCs in North Carolina, at least. And we see that quite a few of them go unpaid. So we don't have the exact numbers, but there are millions of dollars of outstanding court debt. And especially if these FTCs aren't paid within usually like the first year, the probability that they will be paid goes down pretty significantly. So I'm not sure about compared to other jurisdictions, but I do know that I would say that the claim that this gets them to pay is in North Carolina, at least, is somewhat dubious.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
My own experience with this is all very anecdotal from clients who are existing at the very bottom of our income stream, that what these fees do is increase the sense of hopelessness, that they don't see a path in which they could pay off these fees or get a license back. And what that does is it takes people whose participation in the labor market is already limited. It takes whole swaths of the marketplace out of their reach. And it sustains a lifestyle that sort of commits them to operating outside the law. And it's frustrating because, these things are complicated. And to get a lawyer who specializes in representation before the DMV, even those with large hearts, it takes time often to negotiate the different administrative steps to clear these records. And to ask people to do that without a lawyer, sort of they've got to depend on the good graces of the administrative officers and sometimes the court, and sometimes that works. And a very pleasant agent or administrative officer does the right thing. But that's often the exception, and that's the difficult part.
Right.
I remember reading the report from Ferguson, and just how the court fees and the failures to appear and the mounting expenses created a culture of divide between the court and the community. And my sense is we see a lot of that in North Carolina, where we've created a bunch of people who are outcasts from regular participation in community. Dr. Croce, 8 o'clock in the morning is a cruel time to entertain this conversation. We really appreciate the preparation that you made to make this accessible to us. But I do think as we reflect over it, there's very likely going to be some additional questions that we have. And it's so good for you to be available to us. We thank you for that. Part of our process is to see what of this very complicated subject matter area we could make some recommendations to, and I think to the task force. And I think Judge Clark's question or comment today perhaps identify one of those areas that we can make a recommendation on. My guess is we're going to be talking and thinking about this over the next couple of weeks, and it would be really helpful to us if you could be available to respond to questions and suggestions that we have of sending forward to the task force.
You guys have my email address, so feel free to shoot me an email whenever. I also shared the papers and the slides. So if you guys have any deeper questions, I'm not going to make you read the papers that we write. I know it's kind of like an academic thing, but feel free to contact with any questions about either what I talked about or what we've written, or further thoughts.
Thank you so much.
Don't go too far away, because we're going to be discussing a recommendation related to this in just very shortly. But I believe Justice Earls may have had a question.
I did, but I'll email, because I know you're trying to move through the agenda. So, but I do have some questions. Thank you.
And Dr. Croce, your presentation this morning is sort of the last part of a continuing conversation we've been having at the working group on fines and court fines and fees. And so we are hoping to fashion a set of recommendations on the sort of broad subject of fines and fees. But Mercedes, as we transition to this next agenda item, we've had a lot of work offline on some of the recommendations that we've made before in prior weeks. Would you like to sort of catch us up on where these refinements are and what our status is?
Yes, thank you. So I'm sure, you all probably received the email that I sent yesterday, and that had a link to the most recent proposals on racial equity in juries and the increased funding for the Governor's Clemency Office and the Parole Commission. I could pull those up, but I think we want to stick on schedule and have some more time to discuss fines and fees today. If you have any questions about the status of those, click on those links. I incorporated everybody's language, and we're going to get feedback from the full task force and then see where we go from there. So regarding fines and fees, we have discussed a lot. And so what I've done is created a draft and tried to throw a lot of these ideas in under some overarching policy ideas. The three main ones being reducing court fines and fees, eliminating state and municipal government reliance on court fines and fees, and then developing a process to eliminate criminal justice debt. You know, obviously these are all draft, but these are how I felt a lot of these ideas were falling into place. So while we have Dr. Crozier, I wanted to kind of flip things around a little bit and talk about developing a process to eliminate criminal justice debt. So under that idea, one main recommendation could be to stop the suspension of driver's licenses because of financial obligations, because of failures to comply, because of failures to appear. That could be an overarching recommendation. There are some minor recommendations that could be made regarding how notice is given, because Dr. Crozier didn't have the opportunity to get into a lot of detail about the lack of notice that people are given when their license is being suspended. But I think, you know, overarching the message might and should be just stop that suspension from that level. We have not discussed it very much, but I do want to bring to your attention that Commissioner Ezell, who is also a task force member, has made a recommendation regarding administrative license revocations. This is a type of what I've come to process as a decriminalizing of the driving while license revoked charge. And instead of having that charge in a criminal court, it would be moved to DMV court, administrative court. It wouldn't get rid, honestly, of the process or the monetary challenges that come with it, but it would reduce the criminal convictions and the criminal consequences that come with driving while license revoked. So that is another issue that we have not really explored, but there is material on it if you'd like that available. Lastly, on this one similar topic was something that Judge Clark and Judge Thornburg brought up, which I believe just might have been that, or no, excuse me, it was just Judge Clark, and it was in the ACLU report of stop issuing arrest warrants for contempt charges like because of failure to comply or failure to appear, or for other types of traffic violations. So stop issuing those arrest warrants, which would lead people to, and Judge Clark, you can jump in here because this had a little bit to do with what you were talking about, which talks about clarifying the language of a statute to preclude imprisonment for non-payment of fees.
Right, Mercedes. I mean, that's essentially it. You know, my concern is seeing defendants serve beyond their potential maximum sentences for failing to pay fines and fees, and certainly the process is not fair as it is, and clarifying the statute would certainly assist in that process.
And perfect, thank you. I just want to clarify real quick. I misspoke. Commissioner Zell is not actually on the task force, but he did email us about the idea, and he is with the DMV, and so it's an idea that has been rolling around there. So I wanted to correct myself there. So before I move on to any other ideas, is there any discussion about this? My goal for this meeting, if you will, is to see about getting a general consensus on which ideas we want to start developing further. So if you have any, we might do a survey after this. If you think that's the best way, just let me know. So I'm gonna just keep clicking along until you guys say otherwise.
Mercedes, I have something else to say, not to try to complicate things further, but after hearing this presentation by Dr. Crozier, I'm not sure there's an AOC form or uniform process across the state addressing like recalls and these FTA fees. I know in my jurisdiction, we have a form that's used, a recall process with gives the judge discretion to strike the FTA. But if there was some uniform process, a form developed by the AOC, a process by which people could file a motion on their own without payment, without having to pay further cost, and have a judge perhaps review that ex parte for traffic violations only. I don't know if anyone has any thoughts on that, but just something again, access is my concern.
Well, the clerks are judicial officers technically. I mean, they could, I'm sure they want something else to do, but but that's a very real possibility.
Can I jump in real quick with one more research point? So we are actually, over the summer, we've actually spent time trying to assess the failure to appear policies in counties in North Carolina. So we've checked websites and called around to all the clerks. And a really big takeaway so far, this is something we're still kind of like formatting and still trying to kind of work through. But a big takeaway is that it's hard to figure out what to do, especially if you miss court. It's hard to know who to talk to. It's hard to know if you need a lawyer or if not, what form you need or what form you don't need, if you need to come in person, especially right now. So to the extent that we have like a little bit of evidence on that, I would say that something that would be uniform and easy to use would be really, really beneficial.
Excellent. Well, I just made a note of that. And so, all right, well, I will click on forward to another part of ideas that have been floating around. They were mentioned in the ACLU report and other reports regarding, again, the same topic of eliminating criminal justice debt would be to repeal the provisions that are requiring the AOC to report on fee waivers by judges' names. That was a new provision that there's been discussion that is causing kind of a chilling effect for judges to issue the waivers. The AOC is acting in such a way that is, currently having to report the names by judge. And so if we were to still collect the data and issue the reports, but not by judges' names, it might be a way to address that issue of judges making waivers. There's also the issue right now of provisions requiring government agencies to give notice to agencies that require that are collecting fines and fees. The AOC is currently issuing monthly notice to all those agencies, which is kind of satisfying the requirement, but it would be probably preferable to maybe have that language in statute somewhere to clarify that that is appropriate notice. And then the other recommendation that we had discussed was two presentations ago was the draft AOC form regarding the clear energy standards and how to apply for the motion to reduce the fines and fees. We looked at that form before. And I can pull it up again if we'd like.
Mercedes, just processing all of what we've talked about this morning. You realize this is just a huge issue, and Dr. Crozier has given us a hint at just how much ongoing research is going, how much research is ongoing, and how complicated this picture is. I wonder if, as we continue these conversations offline, whether we ought to be looking for both an aspirational goal that we make a recommendation to the task force to eliminate or drastically reduce the fees and the way they compile, but combine that with a more pragmatic view that there are these high offending fees or practices that really are debilitating, and that we can make some very specific recommendations on just 2 or 3 or a handful of these, but to give the governor a very strong indication that this is an area with huge impact on racial equity, the need to take a very granular examination of the whole slate of fees and fines, and to take some dramatic and bold action. I'm just not sure that at our level that we're going to be able to get our hands around the entire picture over the next few weeks. So I'm interested in the comments as we continue this offline conversation about what's doable in terms of what recommendations we can make to the task force.
So yeah, really, I mean, really quickly, we can go through there's a lot more, there's more, right? Because there's providing more court-appointed attorneys. There's an option for district attorneys doing more, like considering amnesty and mass relief opportunities. Then there's talking about like the reducing court and fines and fees specifically. Which ones do we want to either repeal entirely or reduce, or there's the installment fee, there's the jail fee, the community service fee, there's the lab fees. There's the discussion regarding probation and parole fees. What do the recommendations want to look like surrounding that? And then there's the discussion that I think could lend itself to a presentation and a data question regarding municipal revenue reliance on how much they are allocating. And this data question has come up, how much of their budgets have been allocated based on what they're receiving from criminal justice fines and fees. So those are the ideas. And we do have about 3 minutes left before we have our next presenter. So I'd be happy to, we can discuss these, or we can take it offline. We can do a survey like we did before. Open to thoughts and discussion.
Do you have a prepared survey that would tap the general sense of consensus on this area? If so, I think we could do a quick survey. If not, I'm comfortable referring this to continued offline conversations. I think there are just a lot of ideas here that we can, by survey or other means, narrow down what we think we can put forward to the larger task force.
I'd like to have some time to maybe revisit this at another working group meeting, because this is such a huge topic. And in terms of people affected and our ability to make the most impact with with what we're charged with studying in this working group, this is far the most significant, I think. So I think we ought to commit to spending a lot of time thinking through this topic. And I'm not sure I have any particular feedback for you today, but as we kind of look through those slides, I do have some thoughts. And one question is working group 3, or is anybody looking at reclassification of class 3 misdemeanors? And
that would not necessarily, one of the recommendations is not necessarily the reclassification of class 3 misdemeanors, but providing court-appointed attorneys for class 3 misdemeanors. And because
I don't think that, I'm not sure that solves the problem, right?
Mary, Mary, hi, this is Jasmine. Working Group 3 is looking at that issue as a part of the decriminalization charge.
Okay. All right. Thank you. And I'd also be interested in what Judge Thornburg asked before about, have other jurisdictions kind of gotten out in front of us on trying to do some of this work, and what's their experience, and have they been successful? And because that makes a difference. And then the final point I'll make is that I had been working when I was at Prisoner Legal Services with the Equal Access to Justice Coalition, which is a group of, it was civil legal services providers for indigent persons. And there was somebody staffing the group, and her name is Jennifer Simmons, and her specialty was trying to help pro se people navigate the court system more easily. And she was super smart and super insightful, and she might be a good person to bring into the conversation. You really shouldn't have to have a lawyer to get your driver's license back, or to do a lot of these things in the system. So that's all I have to say. I'm sorry, losing my voice this morning.
That's very helpful, Mary. Thank you.
We've worked with Jennifer Simmons, and so I'll definitely see about getting her available to speak. Well,
Well, we've already had a busy and productive morning. Now that your minds are awakened, we're going to continue this conversation. We've had some beginning conversations about extreme sentences and their racially disparate impact on the criminal justice system. When you talk about extreme sentences, there's nothing more extreme than the death penalty. So we thought that giving the working group some framework for understanding the operations of North Carolina's death penalty, we would invite Gretchen Engel, who's the executive director of the Center for Death Penalty Litigation. And Gretchen, we're going to ask you to, now, I guess many people will recognize a historical link between the modern death penalty and other legacy institutions and practices that date back to the country's shameful history. But I think what would be especially helpful is what you've sort of targeted, and that's the sort of real world cost that the death penalty imposes on the system. So thank you for being available this morning, and we look forward to your presentation. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you. Good morning. As Henderson said, I'm Gretchen Engel. I'm the executive director of the Center for Death Penalty Litigation. I came to North Carolina in 1992 to work in capital defense. I was hired by somebody named Henderson Hill. And over the years, I also had the pleasure of working with Mary Pollard as a colleague. I'm going to now try share screen, and we'll see how it all goes. Yep, okay, just a minute. So are you all seeing the screen?
Yes.
Okay, so now I got to figure out how to get it back to the, there we go. All right, I think we're set. So one of the first cases that I worked on was the case of Clinton Jones, who was 18 years old at the time of the robbery and murder that landed him on death row. And 17 years later, I saw him be executed by the state of North Carolina when he was 34 years old. And after his execution, I learned that researchers from Northeastern University had interviewed one of the jurors in Clinton's case. And this is what the juror had to say about my client. This is another client of mine named Robert Bacon. Robert Bacon was tried by an all-white jury for the murder of a white man named Glennie Clark. And Robert's co-defendant, Bonnie Clark, was white. She was married to Glennie. She was having an affair with my client, and it was her idea to kill her husband. And she was the one who lured him to the site where he was murdered. And this is what a juror had to say about Robert. Thankfully, the governor granted clemency to Robert Bacon. But after doing this kind of work for nearly 30 years, I can tell you that, and having seen countless examples of racism in the death penalty, this is very real and very personal. So I've been asked to talk, to set up sort of a framework of talking about the cost, the real cost of the death penalty. And there's different ways to think about cost, right? We can count up dollars and cents, or we can think about, sorry. Hey. We can think about what we're getting for our money. And we know that we spend a lot of dollars and cents. There's a 2009 Duke University study that showed that the death penalty prosecutions cost North Carolina at least $11 million a year. And this is only defense costs, right? So this does not include the resources that the North Carolina Supreme Court or prosecutors or the Office of the Appellate Defender could be using for other things. It also doesn't count the costs that North Carolina taxpayers pay for federal appeals. And so, but then we might say, you know, that, well, what are we getting for our money? You know, maybe $11 million is worth it. And I would suggest to you that we're not getting a lot. We have 140 people on death row. About 90 of them have been there for 10, 20, 30 years. And in the last decade, we've only sentenced 11 people to death. And you can see the yearly totals. You can see that in 7 out of the 3 years in the last decade, we've spent that $11 million to put either 1 or 0 new people on the row. And in the meantime, we have not had an execution since 2006 in 14 years. But as you say, many things are priceless in this world, right? And maybe justice is one of those things that we cannot put a price on. But then again, at that point, we would then ask, well, how well does this system operate? Is this something that we want to keep despite its high costs because it operates with efficiency and it accomplishes goals that we want accomplished? I would suggest to you that if the death penalty were the airlines, none of us would fly. We would be too terrified to do that. And that is because the incredible error rate in capital cases. There's a national study, and I should tell you that at the end of this PowerPoint, there's a list with the URLs of all the studies that I'm referring to, and so you'll have access to those. But Columbia University researchers looked at capital sentencing in basically the first quarter century of operation from 1973 to 1995. And they were looking at times when appellate courts found serious constitutional error that required reversal, that were harmful, unconstitutional errors. Nationally, the rate was 68% of capital cases were reversed in either state or federal court. North Carolina, it was higher than the national average, 71%. Truly, the death penalty is the Ford Pinto in our criminal justice system toolbox. But more disturbing is how wrong we can get it at times. So some of you will recognize Henry McCollum, who was one of 10 people wrongfully convicted and sentenced to death in North Carolina. And Henry McCollum spent more than 30 years on death row for a crime that he did not commit. He was exonerated by DNA evidence in 2014. And unfortunately, the family of Sabrina Bowie, the young girl who was murdered in 1984, has never gotten justice. No one has ever been prosecuted for that murder. Henry McCollum was one of 10, as I said, people who's been wrongfully convicted. And although the error rate would tell us that nothing about the death penalty operates with surgical precision, yet it is eerily good at targeting Black people. Of these 10 exonerees, 9 of them were people of color, 8 of them were Black. There's 1 Latino. Here's a pictures of a few of them. Collectively, these men spent more than 150 years in prison for crimes that they did not commit. Innocent people are disproportionately people of color, and the same is true with other vulnerable groups. If we think about cases that are on the margins, where you would hope perhaps that the mitigating evidence would weigh in favor of a sentence of life, what we find is that disproportionately, again, we see vulnerable people, people of color. So when the US Supreme Court determined that it was unconstitutional to execute people who committed their crimes when they were children, when they were under the age of 18, 3 out of the 4 people in North Carolina who fell into that group were Black. Similarly, since North Carolina enacted a statute barring the execution of people with intellectual disabilities, a move that North Carolina was out front. We were ahead of the US Supreme Court in embracing that 8th Amendment protection. And 16 of the 18 people who were on death row and who have been found to have an intellectual disability were African American in our state. Similarly, if we think about, I'm getting ahead of myself now. I just want to pause here for what I thought was a very powerful portion of Chief Justice Beasley's recent address following the murder of George Floyd, where she talked about the harsher treatment and the more severe punishment, and again, the likelihood of being presumed guilty, all of which we see, right, in the way that wrongfully convicted are disproportionately people of color. And the thing is that the death penalty is supposed to be, it was conceived as this punishment that's for the worst of the worst, right? The worst crimes, the worst people, the most calculated, cruel, killings committed by the most depraved people. And our modern death penalty is not supposed to be arbitrary. And getting the death penalty, in the words of one of the Supreme Court justices in Furman versus Georgia, was it's not supposed to be like being struck by lightning, right? That was Justice White. And it isn't. Unfortunately, again, it's about striking people who are African American. And I would ask you to think about marginal cases. So we have only a few people who are on death row who were non-shooters or non-trigger people, right? Who did not actually kill the victim, but were found guilty because of felony murder. And 3 of the 4 were people of color. Similarly, or 4 of 4, I'm sorry. It's 4 of 4 non-shooters sentenced to death in North Carolina were people of color. As for people who were convicted only of felony murder for some other reason, you know, they participated, but there was some sense on the jury's part that this was not a premeditated murder. 7 out of those 7 are people of color. 6 of them are Black. 1 of them was Latino. And so even in these cases, we also really see that disparity. I want to go back for a minute to what Justice Beasley said about how African Americans are more harshly punished. There's actually research that confirms that statement. It's not simply rhetoric. 2006 study by Stanford University psychologist Jennifer Eberhardt showed that murderers with stereotypically Black-looking features, okay, are more than twice as likely to get the death penalty as lighter-skinned defendants. When Robert Bacon had an execution date in 2001, I called Bonnie Clark's lawyer. And, you know, 13 years before, her lawyer had been court appointed. He had gone on to have a very respectable career. He had been an assistant prosecutor. He was a very successful civil lawyer, confining himself to mostly doing estate and real estate law by the time I talked to him. And I asked him, you know, I said, what do you think? Why is it that Bonnie Clark, your client, got life and my client got death? And this is what he said, just unprompted. This was before I told him about what the juror had said, if you remember the earlier slide, where in fact, the jurors also were focused on race. And so I just never forget that was, somebody who was from that community, who was intimately familiar with that crime. And that was his take on why Robert got death and his white co-defendant got life. And I think another question we always have to ask ourselves is who is it among our citizens who are being served by the death penalty? This is Shirley Burns. She had two sons. One of them you've probably heard of. His name is Marcus Robinson. He was on death row from Fayetteville. When he was 18 years old, he killed a 17-year-old boy named Eric Tornblum in Fayetteville. Marcus is one of the Racial Justice Act plaintiffs, and he was sentenced to death. Ms. Burns' other son was Curtis Green, and he was murdered. Nobody went to death row for that murder. And in fact, when it comes to the death penalty, what we see is that white lives matter. In 2016, FBI data showed that the homicide rate for Black victims was nearly 4 times the national average and more than 6 times that of white victims. And consistently, Black people make up the majority of murder victims, despite being a much smaller percentage of the proportion of the population. But the death penalty is imposed as a punishment for the killing of white people, largely, right? So a 2001 UNC study of homicides between 1993 and 1997 showed that the odds of receiving the death penalty in North Carolina were 3.5 times higher if the victim were white. And more recently, in 2010, Michigan State University study that was used as part of the Racial Justice Act showed that defendants charged with murder in North Carolina from 1990 to 2009 were more than twice as likely to receive the death penalty if the victims were white. I'm coming to the end of my time, and I wish what I told you today was new. But it's not. Today, the Death Penalty Information Center is releasing a report, the cover of which is on the right of your screen, talking about enduring injustice, the persistence of race discrimination and the death penalty. Next month, my office is launching a web-based project that also traces the history of race discrimination and the death penalty. And what I've told you is really an old story, one that Reverend Barber describes as the link between slavery, Jim Crow, lynching, and the death penalty is as connected as the intertwined ropes of the lynchman's noose. So we're at an incredible moment in our history. And we have to ask ourselves what we value. The death penalty is an irrevocable punishment. I think if we continue to tinker with it, we'll execute an innocent person. How could we not do that, given the error rate? The death penalty experiment in North Carolina has been going on for more than 40 years, and we've not come close to eliminating the taint of racial bias. It's time. And I think if we value racial equity, we cannot maintain the death penalty. I really thank you, and I know you all are spending a lot of time on this project, and these issues are so important. I really appreciate the opportunity. I don't know if there might be questions. I'm happy to answer them. And as I mentioned, the studies are here, and I've sent this to Mercedes and Ellen, so we should be all set. And I'll try to figure out how to unshare the screen. That'll be a challenge.
Thank you, Gretchen.
Sure. Stop share. There we go.
I think you and Dr. Crozier have done amazing work to be able to hold the attention on 2 complicated and difficult subjects beginning at 8 o'clock in the morning. There might be some questions today, and let's sort of give the members an opportunity to air either comments or questions from your presentation, Gretchen. Yeah, I'll note that this presentation is really part of a continuing conversation that we've had about extreme sentencing, and from last week about thinking about justice and what purposes justice serves, and the connection between retributive justice or the tension between retributive justice and restorative justice. And these are large concepts that we're only beginning to sort of peel away during the working group session. But I'll note that last week when we heard the story, the experience of Jasmine Corbett, and we heard from Latrina Kelly James, that prompted some discussion from outside our group. I received a very poignant letter from a family member, a survivor, a surviving family member of a murder victim. And she had real concerns about the questions that we're wrestling with. And I think when we take her concerns with the framework that Latrina Kelly James shared with us, you know, one of the big picture issues that we've got to resolve as a community is how we're responding to trauma that violence imposes, how we identify harmed people, and what mechanisms, what institutions we have to respond to that harm. And I think one of the questions that gets related to this is what public safety dollars do we have to address the very real harm that violence causes? And in a world of scarce resources, one of the questions we will have to raise is, yeah, how much of these public safety dollars do we put in this basket or that basket? Which basket is more efficacious in responding and treating the needs of harmed parties? And I think the conversation that we started last week and will continue with individual members, stakeholders in the community, but also as a working group, will be directed to answering that question. You know, one of the things I know that Gretchen didn't get a chance to talk about are the number of cases that will be returning to the trial court level in litigation of the Racial Justice Act. Gretchen, do you have a sense of what that number is?
Yes, thank you, Henderson. So as a result of two rulings by the North Carolina Supreme Court in June, the Racial Justice Act, which was repealed by the General Assembly, is basically been revived for the folks who are still on the row who filed motions under that act in 2010. And that is about 130 people of 140 on the row.
Yeah. And so if you imagine those 130 cases going back to the counties for litigation, I think each one that had been litigated took 2 weeks of court time for the evidentiary preparation, months of pre-hearing time and effort by defense attorneys and by prosecutors, and litigation of motions prior to the hearing. So what we're talking about are huge investments of scarce resources. And again, this is one of the sort of big picture questions that we will be addressing. As I think we come to the close here, I would like to sort of open the floor up to members to sort of give expression to things and comments to what we've been dealing with for the last several weeks. You know, we've been working at a pretty high pace. We're going to not have a meeting next week. Our next working group meeting will be on the 29th. So we will have an opportunity to digest, reflect over, and refine some of the recommendations on the issues that we've touched on before we sort of lead into the new sets of issues, including collateral consequences, prison discipline, and the second look at, all of which are meaty issues. And we thank Gretchen for giving the framework on the death penalty, another issue that's meaty, complicated, and will require more attention. But in the minutes that we have, do any of the members have thoughts or comments, concerns they'd like to share?
Mary, could you give us just a little overview of the materials that you sent to us with regard to the Parole Commission?
Sure. So we had been working on that draft recommendation. I think I started out talking about clemency and the Parole Commission, and we had fleshed it out a little bit as to the clemency office. I wanted to revisit it and make it more specific as to the Parole Commission and get some more details in there for people to consider. So along with Jasmine, we did a little bit of legwork. We interviewed one of the parole commissioners. I did a little bit more research and incorporated some of that feedback and what I learned into the draft proposal that I think Mercedes has revised and circulated. And it just, I mean, just a few more concrete details in there to demonstrate kind of the lack of resources that the Parole Commission has. Some specific suggestions that came from the parole commissioner, such as, you know, I think the task force is recommending racial equity training for many actors in the system and should include the folks who work for the Parole Commission and their staff and the commissioners and their staff. And I also shared some materials. There is one of the things that we had discussed was the fact that there are a lot of folks who are parole eligible and who would have maxed out their sentences had they been sentenced under structured sentencing. And there's actually a calculation and a study report to the legislature every year identifying the numbers of those folks. And I think, I can't remember the exact number, but it was 130, 140 folks in that category. And I don't think it's clear that other than identifying the number of folks, that those folks are getting any, and I think it's pretty clear that they're not getting any additional consideration or meaningful consideration. So again, that's a group of folks that I think the Parole Commission needs to spend more time reviewing and revisiting their cases, and the kind of beefed up that recommendation to support that contention. So I don't know if you have any questions or anything else you'd like me to dig into.
There just seemed to be real consensus that the commission is currently staffed and resourced, does not have the capacity.
Right. I think anybody who was sentenced has parole eligibility. They deserve a fair hearing and a shot, I think, and they're not getting that. Right. That's the bottom line, and they can't get it without more attention and more resources. So.
At this state, are you able to form a recommendation on whether or not reinstatement of parole at large is something that is feasible versus, or what it would take to sort of put the Parole Commission in a position where they could handle that kind of additional responsibility?
Well, I think we need to get them to a place where they can handle the folks they have right now. Okay. But then, going forward, and I hope we're going to have more discussion of this, either some kind of a second look act or perhaps a possibility for folks under structured sentencing to have some sort of parole review. I mean, that's kind of a philosophical issue. Where do you go with it? Do you go back to the courts? Do you go to the executive branch? I don't know. I think y'all know my position that there are some people who are spending too much time in prison for lots of reasons, including racial inequities, and we ought to look at that. So.
Well, Mary, thank you for all of the work that you've done, both in the presentations at the working group, but most especially on the refinements that have been taking place offline. I think it helps certainly inform us and helps clarify where our recommendations, how our recommendations should be directed to the task force. We appreciate that. Well, excellent. I think that we've got a lot to chew on over the next 2 weeks. I thank the members of the working group for their commitment and patience and stick-to-itiveness. It's going to be tested as we're going to try to line up several of these very good recommendations for the task force. Mercedes, are you? It looked like you were biting to say something.
What I'll probably do is put together a survey on some of these fines and fees recommendations and get those started to get circulated around, and we can approach it like we did with the other recommendations from there. Stay tuned.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Dr. Crozier. Thank you, Gretchen. It's been very helpful, very productive morning. Have a great day.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.